absolutely.
Okay, Marley Dawkins.
Yes.
What brings you to the Basis Project? And apparently you know something. You have secrets to tell us.
Yes. Well, my life has been interesting, but then a lot of people's lives have been, and obviously you've interviewed a lot of people. I've watched a lot of your interviews through the years.
There's no therapy for that, not even on the National Health.
And some very interesting insights. And, you know, I thought that one day there will be a situation where we may have an interview and open up some points. So I was, just to give people sort of a background about my life and some things, I was born in Manchester in a place called Moss Side, which, if anyone knows about Manchester, Moss Side is not particularly a very nice area. There's very high gun crime and drugs. My father was a criminal in the area who was, well, working with elements of the Jamaican government and elements of police in the UK, and it was involving a lot of drug running, essentially.
Which James Campbell's father was involved with.
Yeah, that was an interesting point in his story, actually, that I heard originally. And so, at a young age, it was quite commonplace for a lot of drugs and weapons to be around the house, which my mother was getting more and more open to realizing is not a good thing to have around children, ideally. Now, so she made the decision for us to move away from Manchester, and we moved to Bournemouth on the south coast. Now, my mother basically got involved in it, mixed up with some characters like my father, because she left home very, very young. She was about 15 when she left home. And that was because of the situations that were happening with my grandfather and my grandmother that she was living with. Now, that was in and of itself quite a long story, just because there was problems that were happening in the house very often, and we'll go into some of the points now. I mean, for instance, my grandfather, just to give a background on him, he was basically in the Merchant Navy in World War II, and then he went into the Naval Intelligence in and around just after World War II. Now, obviously, Naval Intelligence dissolved in the 60s, but after that period, he basically became a pretty well-respected scientist in the UK.
Could you explain what happened to Naval Intelligence in the 1960s? Was that under the Labour government?
The exact implications of what happened, I'm not 100% sure of, but I do know that the Naval Intelligence was dissolved, essentially. I mean, people can even research this themselves. I believe the Naval Intelligence, if you go on Wikipedia, for instance, you can get information about them being dissolved in the 60s. Obviously, as with any agency that gets dissolved, it's, well, the facilities can still be used, and new names and new agencies take over these places and things like that. And basically, he worked on a lot of different projects for different companies. And a lot of the companies I'm still not certain about to this day. But there is one company that I have a lot of documentation about that he worked for, which were called Plessey. Plessey Caswell in Toaster was the actual facility he worked at. Now, Plessey was a company that were an electronics, defence and telecommunications company for the British government, essentially. Sir John Clark was the chairman of Plessey, and he was a high-ranking Freemason, and he was also in the Naval Intelligence, to my understanding. And the projects that they were working on, my grandfather was quite integral, as many scientists were at the time with Plessey. There was different projects. These are the ones that are public knowledge now, so they're in the public domain. Anybody can get the information on these projects would be radar camouflage materials being used for different craft.
That's basically to make a craft stealthy.
Yeah, exactly. And as a youngster, he would he would explain certain things to me, but he would know that going into the science wouldn't be really much use for a young child to understand. So he would just sort of broadly go over things with me, and he would sort of explain different craft that they were using these materials for. And a lot of these craft, you would say, in design would look like UFOs or...
Now, when you're saying look like UFOs, are you talking look like flying saucers or triangular craft?
Different types. There were certain types definitely like triangle craft in terms of the TR-3Bs, things like that, looking like that design. And then craft that looked like the stealth bombers, and then, yeah, absolutely, saucer-shaped craft as well. Now, this again was just one project at one time, but there was a multitude of projects that Plessy were working on, including infrared technology, breakthroughs in that.
What do you mean by infrared technology?
Well,
night vision or something like that?
Exactly, yeah. Sort of thermal heat mapping, things like that, and Wi-Fi technology. They were responsible essentially for the initial designs for that, as well as I mentioned to you earlier today, holographic data storage, which again was being used. All of these projects were mainly being created for the purpose of defense. So some sort of application of weaponry to improve targeting capabilities, stealth capabilities, these sorts of points. Now, in and amongst this, my grandfather was getting paid very well by this company for participating in these projects. There was also the Concorde, the plane as well, the materials that were used for the nose head so it could move at the speed of sound, like it moved to a point. And he basically, it would be commonplace to every 3 to 6 months for there to be a movement in terms of a different part of the country that he would be posted in. After one project's done in a certain facility, the whole family up and moves and to a new house. So for my mother, that was difficult growing up because she never really had friends for long periods of time. It was sort of, 3 to 6 months, you meet people and then you're saying goodbye again. And my grandmother, who I've never actually met still to this day, was having increasing difficulties with my grandfather. They were, as with many people that worked for the government, big couples from government, essentially, because it's it's quite a simple point, isn't it? Because both people are so used to the parameters of, say, the Official Secrets Act, and
There's not much communication then.
Exactly. So there was a lot of suppression, a lot of silence for long periods of time, and then explosive arguments out of nowhere and things like that. And in and amongst the projects that my grandfather was doing, he was finding out certain things in terms of other applications that he was getting concerned about as well, from my understanding of what he shared with me, in terms of, as with many scientists, it's like you get paid really well for a long period of time to participate in projects and you just sort of turn a blind eye. But there's usually a point where people get to where it is like, is this really my legacy to existence? Is creating weaponry?
Yeah.
And
is it what you call a fit of conscience?
Yeah, exactly. And when he found out other points in terms of what some of the applications of some of the technology he was being paid to make was going to be, it was concerning to him, because For instance, he enjoyed a lot of books and films. 1984, for instance, The Boys from Brazil. So many books and ideas he shared with me. The Coming Race by Edward Buller Lytton. The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky. He was very much into esoteric interests as well as science in and of itself. So he was, as with many scientists, almost a bit of an occultist, you might say, and his speciality was chemistry and electronics, but also he had a good understanding of physics and biology as well. But like I say, there was a turning point within him where he realized that this is going to be dangerous to just keep doing this, and that there has to be a point where the public are able to know about this and able to...
Now, when you say dangerous to keep doing it, I mean dangerous from him being bumped off for some reason, or dangerous because the technology he was developing is literally going to be a serious problem?
Yeah, mainly in terms of the actual technology he was being paid to create. He could see that there could be some really dangerous consequences in future years to come from the points he was creating. In terms of, like I say, just with the one film, if you look at 1984, a lot of the activities that Plessy were participating in were geared towards that, you might say, in terms of improving surveillance and the ability to track people as much as possible, and the ability to do it in such a way where people don't know that it's being done, and that it's being done to pull away their freedom slowly more and more through the years. And there was a friction which happened between my grandfather and my grandmother at some point, and she was not happy about this in terms of, she was just happy to, you know, make a lot of money and to just make all these, you know, what's the problem? Just carry on with it, make the money, it's good for us. And as far as my granddad explaining it anyway, is that she was bugging the house quite a lot because she was working for the MI5, and she was involved in basically getting my grandfather into trouble, essentially, in terms of, I'm not going to have this, you're not going to get away with just deciding to stop this and deciding to do what's good for people. I don't like that. So I'm going to make sure that I receive some nice payoffs to basically shut you up. So the resentment got quite deep after a period of time, and
See, she wanted him to keep doing the work, bringing in the money.
Exactly.
But if she was bugging your grandfather, if MI5 was getting her, was she basically checking, being paid herself by MI5 to see whether your grandfather was leaking or not?
Exactly. And it's very interesting because like I say, my grandmother has never met me. And to my understanding, it's a very good reason for that, is because she was fully aware of the things that my granddad would be teaching me growing up. And she did not want to have to face any of the points in terms of my questions and things like that, because at one point, for instance, just to give an example of how the sort of money that my grandfather was making from the projects he was involved in, I can show you some pictures of some of the properties and things. It was about 3 houses at one time and about sort of 6 or 7 cars, but to him it was all a situation of, you know, you can only accumulate so much wealth, and then eventually you just have to grow a backbone and try and do what's best for the whole of humanity instead of just your own bank account. And there was, well, growing up, he was very used to, he would teach me all types of points. Now, when I say all types of points, he was very broad in terms of what he would teach me. But it would mainly be when my mother wasn't present. Now, my mother has a very rare disability called Behçet's syndrome.
What's that exactly?
It's like an immune deficiency, which basically just has elements of MS in it, and, like arthritis, very bad memory loss, and there is evidence anyway to suggest that a part of my grandfather's fall was also a part of my mother being given this illness, essentially. So, growing up, I was very used to spending a lot of time with him because I never had my father there. I haven't seen or spoken to him since I was about 3 or 4, so I have no idea if he's even alive now. But my mother would be in and out of hospital for very long periods of time. So it would be like 2 weeks she'd be in hospital having various infusions and tests and scans and all sorts of things. And during that time, I'd be with my grandfather every day. And it was always in those points where he would open up the most interesting things with me. He was always aware when my mother was there and when she wasn't there. When she was there, he would just sort of hint about things very lightly. But when she wasn't there, it was almost like the gloves came off and he would sort of open up very, very intricately in terms of things that he knew would be of appeal to me as well, though. So, for instance, there's so many examples of points. I mean, I'd say probably in this country anyway, there's probably not many children that were brought up to believe that Nazis were something supportive, which was quite a strange fuck up for me mentally when I got into teenage years.
Nazis supportive to your grandfather?
The most interesting thing with my grandfather and Nazis, I mean, he literally venerated Germany in a way that I've never seen with anyone still to this day.
In what way did he do that?
Half of his book collection would be German. He could speak German. He would open up to me Nazi principles and what essentially would have happened in the world if they had won the war. And he would always enforce the point with me that they'd never actually lost the war. They just went underground. And
I mean, that's the point. The Nazis effectively run the planet. But
yeah, absolutely.
But what sort of technologies, what sort of things are you talking about?
Well, basically, his understanding was that the Aryan race was a superior race.
Now, what do you define as the Aryan race? There's different versions of this.
Yes,
you're blue-eyed blonde, but a lot of the Nazis weren't blue-eyed blonde.
Absolutely. No, that was very interesting because, and I always found it quite confusing as a child as well, because I'm like, well, if I'm mixed race, if I'm half white and half black, then why are you telling me that the Aryan race are in some way supreme? Or I found that quite confusing where he would explain it, but he would never be racist towards me. It's hard to explain exactly, but...
Well, what is the Aryan race? What is this?
What his understanding of the points was as to why there's some speciality there was a particular group in Germany that was a big part of the Nazi party being set up was the Vril Society and the Tehula Society, I believe the other group was. But there was a book and he would share points with me from it, quite a few books, but The Coming Race was quite a favourite book in the Nazi realms.
What is the coming race? What's the basic nutshell about it?
It's basically that it's believed that a race of large, Aryan, blonde, blue-eyed beings exist underground and have high technology and were in collaboration and communication with certain elements within the German secret societies. Now, so for me, that was always quite striking, to have a grandfather always teaching me that Nazis and Germany, and that there's something beneficial about it. He would always explain to me how the structuring of what was set up in Germany before the war showed how there was beneficial points. He would explain to me about that there was so many unemployed people in Germany before the Nazi Party actually rose to power.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why people say that Germany was so heavily punished after World War One. It gave them, it created a problem which demanded a solution, and the Nazis provided that solution. That's pretty well known.
Absolutely, yeah. And that was always, whenever my mother was there, he would always tread very carefully with these sorts of things. He would just sort of say, well, he'd say something in German and then just sort of mumble some stuff to himself. And he'd always make sure that my mother just sort of didn't ever really hear too much about what he'd be opening up with me.
If I could ask, what race was your grandfather? And
yeah, he was Caucasian. He was white. He was blonde-haired, blue-eyed. So he was Aryan. My mother was sort of brunette. She was Caucasian as well. Sort of brown eyes, but so.
Do you have any Celtic connections, or?
To my understanding, there was some connections, with the Celtic people, but I don't know the details of that. But so moving on, there was. So as I say, the evidence suggests that my grandmother was involved in making sure that my grandfather would fall. He was part of groups, and obviously in these days as well, it was so difficult for anyone who wanted to speak up because there was no internet. Very importantly, your options in terms of sharing things with the public were very limited. Writing books, going to newspapers, and obviously newspapers look at you like you're nuts if you go and talk about some of these projects. And so as the fall happened and everything started getting pulled away, the process with scientists it can be very similar in terms of, if you look at how the elite work, and the Illuminati and all that whole structure, and we can get into that later, but they have an MO with celebrities and politicians particularly, where it's always a point of, you're very much a disposable thing, which is not really very important to us. You're just a face which we can use to generate interest, generate money, and then as soon as you have some level of bravery or backbone or something, then you can just be replaced like that. But with scientists, it's always a little bit different, because they always know that...
Well, they know too much.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like you can't clone a scientist and perfect the consciousness recording as well. So you can't just kill a scientist and then get a copy that has the exact same abilities as the original. Essentially, it will be a flawed copy. So they always have to keep the scientists around, but they usually will just cut the funding, blacklist the name of the scientists so they can't get work on any projects, any well-paid projects. And then essentially sometimes there will be some forms of mind wiping involved, where...
Do you know how that's done?
There's a few ways that it can be done, but... to my understanding anyway, just certain elements can be honed in with different frequency technologies, different MK Ultra applications, different forms of mind control, essentially, which can be used to wipe certain parts of the memory. And because the consciousness is holographic and memory is holographic, so it's like a film, so you can remove certain parts essentially. And because I always found it interesting as a kid that he would never really talk to me about what happened with his time in the Navy and the naval intelligence. He'd never open that up with me. He'd only ever just go into possibilities of science and philosophies, Nazi philosophies, and ideas of what can be achieved with science. It was always a point of explaining to me how to break something down and put it back together. The amount of times I watched him break something down and put it back together, whether it was a bike or a watch or a TV, he would be incredibly skilled at doing those things. And so I had an incredible veneration for him growing up, because to me he was like essentially my father figure. And there was a point where he got in a lot of trouble, and he was also part of an anti-fluoride movement as well, right, within certain scientific communities, which also got him in more trouble.
So what kind of trouble was he?
Well, I mean, like I say,
he must have known something about fluoride.
Well, exactly, yeah. The main point.
Did he tell you about that one?
He did, yeah. It's again, though, he didn't open that up with me until I'd sort of hit teenage years more, because certain things he would not vocalize to me in the really young years. He'd just sort of draw things and hint at things, and then as I got into teenage years, he'd start vocalizing more the points with me, because I'd be able to understand.
But he must have felt that you could understand them.
Yeah, no, definitely certain points he knew that I could understand, and I'm not sure what it was, but it was just the point of I could always tell he wanted me to know certain things in the future. It was almost like he was pre-preparing me or something. It felt like that very often. With the fluoride point, he just explained to me very simply that it was utilized in World War II for concentration camps, or a particular type of fluoride was used, whereby people in concentration camps, Jews and things, had their water supply poisoned with this type of fluoride, which, as he explained to me, when a person has a high level of poisoning of this type of fluoride, it would cause a couple of points. Basically, it can massively accelerate the chances of cancer in a person. And secondly, it has an effect on the psychological state of a person, in terms of it makes them very, very compliant. I mean, there's quite a few chemicals that do that, but it was known to do that, and that was a big part of why the Nazis would do that, because they wanted to make sure it was nice and simple with the concentration camps. They didn't want lots of outbursts and attempted riots and all these sorts of things, so they knew that if they just poisoned the prisoners with fluoride, that you could basically walk them into gas chambers, and they would know, that they're going to be gassed, most of them, but there would be no resistance. It creates this compliance in a person, fluoride poisoning, which is why, how he explained it to me, which is why it was introduced into toothpaste, because they wanted to make sure that, because the elite saw how the Nazis did that and thought that was really interesting, and that should be integrated into the whole public domain, in terms of, well, we should surely have less outbreaks if everyone's just putting fluoride in their mouth all day, every day. Even if there is high amounts of abuse happening in their life, they're getting everything taken away from them. But if you just, as long as they have just a little bit, the TV in their room, they'll be fine, So that was that point. And there was a point which came, and this was because when my mother left home, she was about 15, because she couldn't, as how she explained it to me, she couldn't deal with the arguments anymore that were developing between my grandfather and grandmother. But there was also some other points which at times has been perhaps difficult to explain to people who get to know me and my family. My mother would, because every time they would move the family to a different part of the country for my grandfather's work, to work on a different project, it would always be close to a naval base, close to an air base or a military base, something like that. And multiple times she explained to me where she's in the house, she's going to bed, and there will be a craft that just appears above the house, and everything in the house will start vibrating and shaking, and that the house would be filling with light. And then she would discuss with me about seeing beings in her room quite often and being paralyzed. Beings with black eyes, she would always highlight that point to me.
Were they round black eyes?
Yeah. And
I mean, we're talking,
yes,
generated life form.
Absolutely. And ever since then, when she kept having these traumatic points, when she'd be reading books or magazines, she would go through a process of always scribbling out people's eyes and blacking them out. And I noticed her doing that even in her 40s and 50s when I was young, and I'd notice it, and that was when she first told me it, because I would ask her, why are you colouring out the eyes? And that was a part of why she left home early, because she was, as she shared it with me, was just finding it too traumatic, the whole deal of the constant arguments, the constant friction, and then not knowing when light and craft are going to appear, and strange beings and things.
What happened with those situations? Did they take her?
That's something.
And who else did they take?
Yeah, no, this is something that I've really tried to delve into more, but it's very difficult. My mother, her memory around the point seems to be very hazy, which I also think is because of how many drugs she's been taking now for how many years. It's a massive concoction. We're talking a good sort of...
Are these medical drugs?
Yeah, we're talking 20 plus different medications a day that she takes.
And this was to do with her illness?
Yeah, which again, as I understand it, I mean, I went through a point of resentment towards my grandfather about it, because I really blamed him for it, for her illness.
So this wasn't something that naturally evolved, it was given, and these beings came along.
And I'm not sure what their involvement was, because every time I have attempted to open up the points with my mother and with my grandfather, it would always be sort of this blank screen, like they wouldn't remember anything other than, well, my mother would remember being paralyzed and seeing them, but that's it. There would never be any more detail than that, and I'd always find that really confusing. Why? So why do you know that, and you're not telling me anything else, or maybe you just don't know? Or
were there any things left around the house which indicated these things had actually been there?
That's again something I have asked before, and it's always like this blank stare that comes across my mother's face, like she just has no recollection. But she never forgets the beings and the experience of being petrified and frozen with fear. And one time she explained that my grandfather just came into her room and would comfort her as if it's just like, it's okay. It's just, don't worry, it's okay. It's going to be gone in a minute. Don't worry about it. That sort of attitude. And so she couldn't deal with that eventually, all of the points, and so she left home. And she got, like I say, mixed up with some interesting characters. She basically became a bit of a groupie with different rock bands, things like that, traveling around with them. She just basically went really extreme with the partying point to try and really, I think, sort of forget some of the things that she'd been experiencing in younger years. And she basically did not see her mother and father for a long time when she left home. It was like she didn't speak to my grandfather again till she was around in her 40s even. So she left at like 15 and didn't communicate with my grandfather again for a long time. And she basically found him in his 40s, and he was basically in a one-bedroom bedsit with no recollection of how he'd got there. Now, bear in mind that the last time my mother had seen my grandfather was within a giant 7-bedroom house with multiple cars and very good money around.
Yeah.
And then she used to find him years and years later in this 1-bedroom bedsit with pieces of memory missing, in terms of he himself couldn't remember how he actually got there, and how, what had happened essentially. So then she started communicating again with her mother, with my grandmother, and it's quite strange actually. They still communicate to this day, and it's because my mother, she knows as well now from me and from all the points we've looked at and investigated. She knows that my grandmother, was intricately involved in this, in terms of the fall of my grandfather, and she knows that she has a lot of money, and she does, and that's basically why they are still in communication, to my understanding. She's sort of trying to work out a way to get some of the family wealth back in some way. But I have no interest in meeting her, because I know what sort of person she is. From how I've seen her, I've spoken to her on the phone a couple of times, and she's very much identical to the Queen, I'd say. But then again, in this country...
In what way is she identical to the Queen? I mean,
yeah.
Physically or what?
Mentally. It's a very common thing in this country with females, psychologically, in terms of... Because the Queen is the apex female in the world system, it causes many females to notice that, obviously, and to endorse that as themselves, to take that on as their consciousness, in terms of that's how I must be. I must design my character as an almighty that looks down on other people and just demands all the time, and that's basically the sort of character that my grandmother is. She never, ever will offer support. She will always demand that you must do something for me, and then maybe I'll give you a
service to self.
Yeah, maybe then I'll give you a crumb off the plate later, maybe. Yeah. Only if you're compliant though. And so that's been a big friction point with those two, my mother and my grandmother. They have had a lot of disagreements on the phone. I've overheard a lot of times in recent years. And so, I mean, my grandfather now, he died sort of a few years ago now, in 2013. And that affected me quite a lot, because like I say, he was a very important character to me.
I mean,
and
why did you never see your father? Why does this gap?
Yeah, well, it's another point as well, which is just interesting in terms of he had this concept, as many males can do, Jamaican males as well, I would say. It's a commonplace point of you just spread your seed in as many places as possible, and you don't actually take any responsibility to develop as a father for one child. So that's, to my understanding anyway, why I haven't had any communication with him. But obviously when you're getting distracted with drugs and
So when you left Manchester, did your father come with you? Did he stay in Manchester?
He stayed in Manchester. Yeah,
so essentially
the operation.
They broke up.
Yeah, absolutely. The operations he was involved in obviously took precedent to him in terms of the money he was making from drugs and guns and back and forward from Manchester to Jamaica and all of those sorts of points. And but yeah, I mean, just again bringing it back to some things that my grandfather opened up with me. He would often. He basically got me interested in comic books. So he would when he started explaining to me about Marvel comics and that I should start reading Marvel comics because it's other points that he had overheard about, and it was never his field of speciality, but he had heard about points that were being done in connection with some of the projects he was working on, because his field was more sort of craft based most of the time, craft and electronic based, and but he knew other scientists where it's biology based and biotech, and
so essentially, if you want to know what's going on, look at Marvel Comics, or as they were then.
yeah, I mean, there's some people that have made some comments, but I can remember very specifically when I was about 11 and I'm reading a Spider-Man comic book, and he comes over my shoulder and he starts just explaining to me and drawing, writing it down on a piece of paper, how you make an actual Spider-Man through science and what you would want to make one for. He would explain to me, and again, at the time I just didn't really understand genetic recombination. You'd explain about that you can create a being that has a certain percentage of spider genes within their makeup, and that being then, depending on what percentages you put in, would have certain capabilities of a spider, but they'd be in a human form. So, the ability to sort of see things slower, quick reflexes, even the ability to create webbing from, and it's interesting because
the web thing out of his
from your hand, yeah, because what was and it was only about 3-4 years ago I was looking at a story about a spider goat that had been created through genetic recombination again, which is just
I think that's for the milk.
Yeah, that's right. And but they found that this like a webbing, this spider goat could create.
That silk? Is that not silkworms?
I'm not 100% sure.
The silk that was produced by the silkworm produced a bulletproof silk.
Yes, well, this is interesting because
the strongest material on Earth is a spider.
Exactly. Yeah, he would explain that, why you would want to do that with a being in terms of giving them spider genes, because he'd explain that if a spider was actually the size of a human, that their webbing would be so incredibly strong. And he'd explain about ants a lot as well, and in terms of that point, that if ants were the size of humans, they would be running the planet. He'd always enforce that point to me.
Well, maybe they are.
well, that's worth consideration, yeah. But so that was interesting as well. That sparked off interest in me, obviously, and in teenage years, then it was easier for me to understand some of the points in terms of super soldier projects and things like that had been done and have been done, which...
What do you mean by a super soldier?
Yeah,
I mean, the super soldier thing is a thing that was used in a conference. It was a way of sort of... It doesn't mean...
No.
All the context doesn't mean sort of huge sort of Marvel thing, but I mean, you're talking Marvel comic characters.
Well, the point is as well that he would always go over with me is that it's massively exaggerated in the comics, and they have to do that for a reason. They have to, because that's a part of the programming of the public. Yeah. Because he would explain that Marvel Comics was actually to mask over the actual real projects being done, but you have to exaggerate them for entertainment value. Yeah. Is important. So absolutely, when you hear some characters, and some characters I've heard you interviewing through the years, there's a misunderstanding in terms of it's very much believed that, creating beings like indestructible beings, this whole idea. Now, this search for immortality is genuinely something which has been happening for a long time. The Nazis were interested in that. I mean, that's a big part of some of, again, the belief systems the Nazis had about being eternally in one vessel and a 1,000-year Reich and things like that. But
I think you were going to talk about the history of humanity
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, but just to finish that point, he would just say that basically it's heavily exaggerated, but the projects are happening. So that they're, and he explained to me about some Russian project that he wasn't working on, because like I say, his speciality was not biology and soldiers and all that side of things, but that he had heard that the Russians had done some sort of project in the 40s, which was basically putting like these diodes in the brains of these soldiers that would cut off the like the nerve centers so that they wouldn't be able to feel pain, essentially. Yeah. And that when they did that to them, that they would replace certain parts of the body with metal prosthesis and things like
You're
that.
You're talking cyborgs.
Yeah, exactly. But then
this is the Russians doing this.
Yeah, this was specifically, he would mention that to me, and that was a big part of what happened around World War II. The Nazis and the Russians and the Americans were all started doing that, and they're all started battling to, you know, who can do the best, most impressive thing, essentially.
I mean, this is what Kathy Morgan's found out about in this country, the use of the...
yeah, I'm aware of Kathy
about
Morgan's.
the brain, how the brain, if you lose a limb, the brain still thinks there's something there. And the research for this was so that the brain could then interface with a metallic limb.
Yeah, yeah,
and that was
absolutely.
being done in London. In England, not London, but... Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, in terms of the projects he was actually working on for Plessy, even though there was some other companies he worked for that I don't actually know about, but the radar camouflage technology and the holographic data storage, he knew that those 2 points were being applied within the biology spheres as well. So they were being used with soldiers and applications like that. So, but the Russian, that particular experiment, he explained that all the subjects ended up dying because, as they learnt at the time, because they didn't realise that the metal prosthesis would create tumours and like metal poisoning throughout the body, and yeah, all these guys would end up dying and stuff. But again, that's
but
just...
it's only recently, or that's how the use of titanium parts and stuff like that doesn't seem to...
Yeah.
I mean, you've got motorbike racing people who've severe injuries and a lot of...
Yes. Well, that's interesting because as the advancements of nanotechnology have grown, and biotechnology and science in general, there's definitely been a lot of applications when you say in terms of bulletproof materials, bomb-proof materials, and sort of meshing, sort of like in terms of not replacing bones with an actual metallic structure, but actually small nanites that actually knit together around the bones to create sort of a plating.
You would have a healing property, much faster healing.
Well, yeah, that would be the biological side, yeah. But in terms of the just the structuring of the skeleton, that it could be sort of plated with these small little nanite robots that sort of
because
just
one of the things
together.
about improving your muscles and all that sort of stuff is you've still got to have those stress, the moment of action through the bones and the joints have got to take that force.
Exactly.
There's no point being able to have the muscle power to lift 10-ton trucks, but the bones have got to work.
Exactly, yeah, because
the whole skeleton it must do that.
Yeah, no, because I mean, there's a lot of obviously information out there with the whole NHCU point, and.
But when did you first hear about NHCUs?
I heard that sort of in teenage years. That wasn't from my grandfather, because the points that he shared with me led me to looking into certain points and understanding, or getting a better understanding anyway, of what is actually possible through science. So then I could...
Now, what's the difference? I mean, Mary King is talking about these things, the program generated life forms, PGLF.
Yeah.
So do you know if there's a difference between those two?
A difference between...
The NHCU, that's non-human cyborg units.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my understanding is that non-human cyborg units is a weaponry creation, essentially, for the most part.
Where are these things being used? Because you don't see them walking about the
No.
battlefield.
No.
Not too many of them anyway.
No, absolutely. I mean, the applications, you know, they're quite widespread, aren't they? Because at the end of the day, you can have a small squadron of 3 or 4 of these guys, which are able to do a lot more than a large battalion of normal soldiers. So it keeps things a lot smaller and compact and more quiet for certain operations. It was my understanding anyway. Yeah. But then the programmable life forms you talk about, that I've heard can be used in terms of manipulating people, in terms of mind controlling them to believe that they're looking at aliens and that they're having alien experiences.
I mean, that was Barry King's initial thing. I mean, is that where you got that from?
Well,
where did you get that information from?
My grandfather already highlighted points with that to me in terms of life forms that are just being created to traumatize people.
There's a lot of ways of traumatizing somebody without just using a biologically created thing. I mean, where were they being used?
Because because the Nazis, their main point in terms of one of the greatest points to control society in the end is a staged alien invasion. So, to my understanding,
Werner von Braun referred to.
Yeah. There's a lot of people that obviously have referred to this stuff I'm talking about through the years, and that if you just create life forms that look like aliens, and then you've got craft that look like alien craft, then you've got it together. Exactly. You can just, and it's a perfect system placement for controlling humans to completely submit to the government and completely offer everything.
Well, this is a lot of effort. Are you suggesting the government itself is alien?
Okay, well, let's... I'm not saying they're aliens, no, because they're not. But okay, let's go into the history of humanity, I'd say, a bit here. Now, in teenage years, as I'm finding out different points from my grandfather and getting confused by a lot of it and getting very annoyed and frustrated about my mother and her disability and my grandfather losing all his sort of money and his credibility and having to look after my mother and everything like that. I was getting a lot of stress inside myself, and I started acting out a lot. I started getting involved in quite a bit of crime, just in terms of just anything to try and alleviate the annoyance I'd be experiencing inside myself, and also kind of like a type of resentment towards myself because of believing that, you know, that being mixed race is not a good thing. It's a bad thing, that it's something I started judging myself more and more for. And so as I'm getting more angry and I'm getting into trouble all the time, I'm getting arrested all the time, and
have you been to prison? I mean, is that just part of the course?
No, it's basically, that's very close on a few times. But what happened was I started realizing that, okay, there's something wrong here. Like, the way I'm thinking about things is going to end very clearly with me going to prison or me dying very soon. And I realized that, okay, now if I was to die tomorrow or go to prison for the rest of my life or whatever, do I really want, you know, all that I've left here to be just abusing people, basically? Yeah. And I wasn't willing to just accept that. So I started researching sort of self-development and anything to try and change the mind, in terms of ascension, meditation, different concepts of the meaning of life and things like that, basically. And I got really deeply into spirituality, to the point where I'd be meditating every day for hours and hours, going to different dimensions in my mind and talking with different beings in my mind. I would go to...
Did that actually happen? I mean, or
No.
you just,
No, it didn't. But the mind is very powerful, and so I'd even go out to places like the New Forest, which is a large forest near me, and like meditate there at night for hours, like by myself.
were you trained in any kind of meditation? Or did you just do that?
It's something that I self-developed through, knowledge and information I'd heard, and just testing it. And because of how the mind works, basically anything you believe with enough thought power, your brain, the DMT will release and will fill in the gaps for you. And that's where a lot of people, when they have, divine experiences, they believe they've had, and they haven't actually had those experiences. It's just that it's their mind that's been fucking with them. And because they've been so desperate to have a divine experience, their mind has actually generated it for them. And I've seen that for myself. I know that's the case. So, and now from there, because when it comes to the New Forest, though, that's quite an interesting point. I mean, we could talk about the New Forest for a long time, because that's one of the...
Well, why don't we, we're coming very close to the end of this first part. Why don't we just hold that thought?
Yeah.
And we'll take a quick break. But really, to summarise in this first part, your grandfather seems to be involved with basically the making of cyborg units and programmed life forms, and in that, Plessy was involved with all that sort of stuff.
Not with programmed life forms and cyborgs, but some elements of the projects that he was involved in were used for those points from different
Well, I think
scientific
with such a
groups.
complicated project, an aircraft needs lots of things put into it.
Yeah.
These cyborg units would need a lot put in it.
Absolutely. I mean, and he was the first person that explained like maglev technology to me, for instance, like
Now, that's
magnetic
the
levitation.
magnetic levitation.
Yeah, for underground rail systems and things, and how they'd all be connected. Because again, he wasn't a geologist, but he knew geologists that would talk to him about that, and he would assist with some of the maglev developments there.
Did you ever meet James Casbolt?
No, I didn't actually, no.
Anyway, on that little bit, we'll take a quick break, but we'll hold for the forest until this.